Morning, everyone, and welcome this is the first of ARHU's new Colloquium series on race, equity, and justice. I'm Bonnie Thornton-Dill, Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities and professor in the newly renamed Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And just a shout out to my colleagues for their creativity and hard work to get this name change in place. This series is part of ARHU's broad initiative on race, equity, and social justice, which is developing goals related to the eradication and dismantling of structural racism and strategies to ensure equity and social justice throughout the college, campus, and community. These include transforming curriculum and scholarship, reducing discrimination in teaching, research, and service, and expanding the impact of ARHU's work, which we've been doing for a long time and continue to do, on racism, anti-racism, equity, and justice through community and other partnerships. Consistent with President Pine's call to focus on race and identity as we welcome new members of our community, we are pleased to have students participating with us this morning as part of the new Terrapin Strong onboarding program. In ARHU, part of our approach is to offer opportunities for you to be exposed to the many different ways faculty and scholars in the college study and teach about these issues. In this series, I am inviting faculty experts from across ARHU to discuss their scholarship and creative projects related to anti-racism and social justice. The format for each session will include a mini presentation by the scholar, and then she and I, or he and I, will have a conversation, begin a conversation, and then open it up for questions from the participants, the Zoom participants. So we have asked that your microphones remain on mute, certainly during the presentation. And during the last 20 minutes, you'll be invited to submit questions through the chat, which is being moderated by Associate Dean Linda Aljouri, who will read your questions. Now, I will say this is the first time we've done this, so we're figuring out what will work and what will not work. We thought that having questions through the chat would allow us to get more questions in, but we'll see how that goes. And please note also, I think it was advertised, that the initial talk and conversation is being recorded for future viewing on ARHU's website. So let's get to today. This is really a special treat and a wonderful way to begin, or almost begin, I think it began yesterday, Latinx Heritage Month. Today's session features Perla Guerrero, Associate Professor of American Studies and U.S. Latinx Studies. Dr. Guerrero's expertise is in relational and comparative race and ethnicity, with a focus on Latinx and Asian Americans. She studies these groups in relationship to issues of space and place, immigration, labor, U.S. history, and the U.S. South. Her talk, Latinxs on Both Sides of Inequality and Fighting for Justice, will focus on racialization, the different ways that Latinx communities are perceived, and the way these communities address justice and equity. So at this time, I'm happy to turn the microphone over to Dr. Perla Guerrero. Perla.
Thank you so much. It's an honor for me to be here and to kick off this wonderful colloquium. So just so the audience knows, I'm going to talk for just about 10 minutes to give you a broad overview of my work, particularly my first book, and then I'm going to wrap that up by bringing it a little bit more to the contemporary moment. And, you know, as an author, you always kind of have maybe, you wish you could add more stuff to the book. So I think the last few minutes would address that. How would I kind of conclude the book today? So thank you so much for being here. So as Dr. Thornton-Dill said, my area of expertise is in relational race and ethnicity. So broadly what this means is that Increasingly, we understand that race is a social construction that depends on certainly what people look like, what we in the past have called phenotype, but also increasingly on how we recognize that clothing matters, language, spoken, accent or lack thereof. There are a wide variety of factors in the way that we make sense of other people. And broadly speaking, the way we make sense of other people is by looking to the scripts with which we're already familiar. And so my first book is called Nuevo South, Latinas, Latinos, Asians, and the Remaking of Place. And that book looked at the state of Arkansas and three groups that arrived in Arkansas in the late 20th century. So Vietnamese in 1975, right after the end of the Vietnam War, who were placed in Arkansas to be processed as refugees. Cubans from the port of Mariel in 1980, who were also placed in Arkansas to be processed. I'll speak a little bit more about that in depth, but it's important, although we now think of the 1980 Mariel group as refugees, at that moment there was a lot of questions on whether they would be processed as refugees, on their legal status. There are more issues to get into with that. And then in the 1990s with Mexican immigration. Now, when I first started researching the project, presenting on the project, I used to get questions about the Black community, right? What did Black Arkansans think of these new groups? And that really pushed me to start to get more information, not just about the Black community, but actually about why in Northwest Arkansas, which is where the study is focused, there weren't a lot of Black communities. If you divide the state of Arkansas, which is roughly into a square, if you divide that into roughly 4 squares, the 3 other counties that make up Arkansas had anywhere between 100,000 and 160,000 African Americans. The northwest corner where my study is situated had like 10,000 African Americans for the past 40, 50 years. So it was a broad discrepancy. And so what that pushed me to investigate is, why does Northwest Arkansas have such a lack of representation? Why does it lack Black communities? It's also important to note too that of the 10,000 African Americans in this quadrant, what used to be a congressional district, 80% of those lived in one city, which was also the city where the flagship campus to the University of Arkansas was, which is Fayetteville. With the other 20% largely being in another city about 50 minutes south, in Fort Smith. And so really this quadrant then was overwhelmingly white. So what I realized as I started investigating why this was, is that there had been racial cleansing in that part of, not just the state, but that part of the country, into Southwest Missouri, and Southeast Missouri. You probably all have heard more recently about the Tulsa race riot, where white people killed killed Black people in a very wealthy Black community. So there's this swath of the United States that was overwhelmingly white throughout the 20th century, but because of racial cleansing, because Black communities had been removed. And so I started my book off with that because I think it's an important history in terms of thinking through issues of Latinx equality and justice, right? These groups, both as refugees or as immigrants, did not enter an untainted place. Anti-Blackness had very much formed. Arkansas has formed the United States. And so then what does it mean when new groups arrive into the area? So a very broad overview is that while Vietnamese were reluctantly welcomed, they were reluctantly welcomed because a lot of Americans felt an obligation to help Vietnamese, many of whom had helped us during the war in Vietnam. There were discussions of allegiances and alliances that we had built as a country, that we owed them this. In Arkansas, the other big push to reluctantly welcome Vietnamese and other Southeast Asians like Laotians and Cambodians, people from Laos, I guess I should say Lao people, was Christianity, right? So that the Christian thing to do was to help our neighbors, etc. So they were reluctantly welcomed. They were placed and processed in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. And many of the Vietnamese community and the Southeast Asian community left to other parts of the country, including California, and other sites. Nevertheless, a small community of Southeast Asian, majority Vietnamese, stayed in the state. Churches sponsored large family members, individual families sponsored smaller families or individuals. And so Arkansas has a small but growing Asian American community that can trace its roots back to the repercussions of the Vietnam War. So that was in 75. In 1980, Fidel Castro opens the port of Mariel, says anybody who wants to leave the island can do so. In order to leave the island, you had to have what was called a carta de escoria, or a drag letter, something that the state of Cuba said you were undesirable. And so they were expelling you. So initially, the Cuban diaspora already in the United States, who had arrived in the decades prior to 1980, was excited that they can welcome friends, family, cousins, relatives. But soon, weeks after, the media discourse really changed to, these are prostitutes, they're homosexuals, they're dangerous, they're prisoners. We can't allow them in the way we had allowed what are called golden exiles, people from Cuba into the United States willy-nilly, right? So this cohort of Cubans in 1980 was the first cohort that really experienced camp life. They had to be placed in a camp to be processed. They also had to secure sponsorship to be let out. This was a process that was very dragged out and was very unfamiliar to them. Cubans knew that their family members or prior cohorts had not been encamped in this way. And so there was a lot of frustration, a lot of confusion. At some point, there was an uprising in Fort Chaffee. The Cubans broke the camp perimeter, and that freaked out then Governor Bill Clinton. He called in the National Guard. He said, we have to secure our borders, meaning the state borders. We have to protect ourselves. Arkansans that were next to the camp were convinced that they heard Cubans say, come on, Castro, let's kill some Americans, which doesn't really make sense because this cohort of Cubans was also largely what we might conceive of as working class, working poor. They were not the elite of the country. They didn't speak English. So that line just was probably untrue. So this really stoked a particular fear, not just about Cubans, but about who these groups of Cubans were, right? They had grown up under communism, so people thought they were secret agents working for Castro. A lot of queer people, gay and lesbian people, transgender people left Cuba during this time. And so they were harassed within the camps. And so as a consequence of that, they tended to either self-segregate into smaller sections of the camp or were pushed to segregate by other Cubans who didn't want anything to do with them. So this group of Cubans was cast as communist, criminal, and homosexual. It's also important to know, especially in the context of Cuban diaspora and, well, the book, that these Cubans were also largely Black Cubans. That also is quite different than the prior groups, the two prior cohorts that arrived in the United States. And we can talk a little bit more about that in the questions if you're interested. But the fact that these were Black Cubans, working poor, working class, with gay representation also really freaked out Arkansans. They wanted to close the camp down. Nationally, the repercussion of this, one of Clinton's biographers argues that this experience with Fort Chaffee is the reason why Clinton, as a president, installed the wet foot, dry foot policy, right? He was the first president to kind of push for a change for the way that the United States engages with Cuban nationals. And then finally in the 1990s, Mexican immigrants begin to arrive, and they're drawn to the state of Arkansas and other parts of the South for work in the poultry industry, meatpacking. In Georgia, it's also carpeting. North Carolina, it's tobacco. So this was a moment where California and the nation was experiencing a large recession. A lot of people who had been employed in California could not find jobs there, and so they migrated to the South. And they end up working in the poultry industry. And so when Mexican immigrants arrived, they're cast and racialized. At first, people didn't know. They had the specter of Mexican illegals, quote unquote, but they didn't necessarily know what Mexicans looked like. So initially, they were unmarked. But over the period of 5, 10, 20 years, that's when you saw a change from the specter or the fear, or the ghost of the quote unquote illegal alien to individuals being racialized and targeted, their movements being policed in public space, people complaining about the fact that they were at parks, people complaining about the fact that they were barbecuing at the parks or barbecuing at their backyard. And there's a quote in the book by an Arkansan who said, if they were just inside, then this park would be the same. So the implication being that she literally didn't want to see any Latinos. She didn't want them to be using public space. In the book, I talk much more about the fact that Latinos and Latinxs were not breaking social norms. They were not breaking social rules. It was literally who they were. That was a problem. So the region is really important to racial formation. At some point, Latinxs were compared to Vietnamese. Arkansan said, well, we never had to translate anything for Vietnamese, which A, was not true, but B, also ignored the resources that some Vietnamese arrived with. Since this was the first cohort to leave Vietnam, they came with resources. Many were already fluent, etc. So at the end of the book, I mentioned briefly Marshallese, who are Pacific Islanders who have this weird status with the United States as the kind of newest community that was arriving to work in the poultry industry. And when Marshallese arrived, they're kind of pit against Latinxs. It's like, well, Latinxs do this, Marshallese do this. So we see the kind of reification of racialized difference as new groups arrive. And I know I'm already over. So the last point I want to make is that, Latinxs on both sides of equity and justice, we have to both recognize the way in which we contribute to the oppression of other groups and the ways in which we benefit from white supremacy or being perhaps seen as local in some sort of way. And that also ideas of family in the United States, of normative family, are really important and have been used to say, well, these groups are good. Latinx teen pregnancies are fine because they believe in the family, versus Black teen pregnancies because Black families are not normative. They're just going to be single mothers, right? There's a way in which these really pernicious negative ideas permeate multiple areas of our lives. And Latinxs, we have to be better. We have to do better by other people and certainly for ourselves, so that we can work toward a common goal. Thank you.
I'm fascinated as someone who lived and worked in Tennessee, right, in West Tennessee, in Memphis, so near Arkansas. I'm fascinated to know that history of racial cleansing. I was not familiar with it, and I think it's really interesting and profound to look at how all of that racial cleansing occurred in this area, and then you get one group after another, the Vietnamese and the Cubans and the Mexicans. And then you said Marshallese, and I assume you're talking about people from the Marshall Islands.
Yes.
Kind of coming in, and all of that racial history kind of and that those attitudes about difference and all of that still being there and shaping in many ways. So that's that. What led you to this research topic?
That's a great question. It's a question I've received before. So my family was part of that migration from California to Arkansas. Like many other families, my dad had lost his job, was unable to find work in California, and through, as often happens, social networks through one of my godfathers who had moved to Arkansas because his brother had moved to Arkansas. My godfather called my dad and was like, you should come to Arkansas. You can work in chicken. My dad didn't know what that was or what that meant. And, but he went to check it out. And my dad got a job in Arkansas the day after he arrived. And so then shortly thereafter, the rest of my family joined him in Arkansas. I can say as someone who grew up in Los Angeles that moving to Arkansas was quite a shock. Not even because I was used to an urban area, but ideas of race were so different. In Arkansas, part of what happened was that, well, I should say in LA, everyone quote unquote knew I was Mexican. So there's an element certainly of racialization. And in Arkansas, people thought I was Vietnamese, and I didn't understand why. People in the city where I moved to, which was Fort Smith, for high school, thought I was Vietnamese. Then I went to college close to Little Rock, where there was a very small Southeast Asian community. And near my college town, people thought I was white. And really those experiences of being constructed as a different race made me wonder what this all about. Like, how could I, who hadn't changed physically, be constructed in these two different ways? So essentially, I mean, one of the lines I use a lot is like, Arkansas traumatized me so much that I had to go to graduate school to figure out what had happened. How did this take place? So that's why I came to the project.
But you know, that's really an important message, because you know, we talk a lot about the need for more diversity in the academy and the need, and here it is. I mean, it's like people bring their lives and their experiences to their research, and that's what you're saying. Many of us wouldn't know about this if you had not had this experience and did not really feel the need to write about it. And it enriches and deepens our understanding of what race is, what it means, how it shifts and changes. So, so thank you. I'm really glad you shared that, because that's, I'm sure you said, as you introduced yourself, that you were going to say a little bit more about the contemporary, and then you said, oh, I'm running out of time. I better stop. But I wanted to give you a chance to just say what you wanted to say about it.
Yeah, thank you. So, you know, I think in the contemporary moment, we really, the larger backstory to Latinidad in the United States is that it's built on believing in white supremacy, on perpetuating white supremacy. There's an article by a Latinx studies scholar called something like Latinos and the Faustian Pact with Whiteness. The author is, if I remember correctly, Neil Foley. It's an article I teach a lot in my USLT classes. And I like that article a lot because he articulates very clearly the fact that Mexicans and Latinxs in the United States, broadly speaking, have really bought into white supremacy. We try to, and the way that we do that is by trying to place ourselves closer to whiteness, to construct ourselves as perhaps as white as we can be. Some of us are white passing, some of us are white. This is the other really important thing, and the complex part of Latinidad or Latinxs is that we are Black, we are Indigenous, we are Asian, we are mixed, and we're white. And so there's a way in which sometimes discussing Latinidad, it purports to be like a structured, a homogenous category, when in reality it isn't. Race and class and gender and sexual orientation really define that. But because so many Latinxs are mestizos, are mixed, can pass for white, are white, there's anti-Blackness in Latinidad. And in this contemporary moment, if in the past everyone kind of knew, but we pretended we didn't, we are not in that place any longer. We have to do much better by our Black and Indigenous brothers and sisters. Latinidad and Latinx studies certainly cannot just stand by and kind of work in our little, pretend we can work in our little corner, because we are not that. We are these communities are part of who we are, and we cannot and should not deny that. So that's what I meant, the benefiting from white supremacy, contributing to it, and yet also experiencing discrimination and xenophobia. Sometimes our community can be maybe a little too laser focused on our own subjective experiences as opposed to looking out and expanding to see what other people's experiences are like.
So I want to ask you to unpack that a little bit, because you said we have to do much better, and you just kind of started. So maybe you could say a little bit more about what doing much better looks like.
Yeah, so for example, I mean, I think a really great example is some immigrant rights organizations are calling for the abolishment of ICE, which Immigration Customs Enforcement, this is the arm of the US government that is in charge of detaining and deporting immigrants. It's like the immigration police force. And yet, so in the same breath, they might say we need to abolish this particular immigration force, but they're not thinking critically about policing in the United States. They're not thinking about police brutality that targets Black people, Black men in particular. And so that's what I mean. We have to do better. How can we, on the one hand, be saying we want to end, if that, you know, if that's where your politics are, we want to end ICE, we want to abolish ICE, and yet be okay with like Black kids, Black boys and Black girls who are in juvenile detention, who are increasingly funneled into the prison system, right? Both of these systems are cages for human beings. And if we want to abolish one, then we should want to abolish the other. So part of the way that we can do better is by learning more, by learning more generally US history, and to understand the way that our struggles have been interconnected, to understand what we have done wrong before, again, in terms of aligning more with white supremacy, or trying to benefit from the system, but also to really understand that, again, despite the discrimination or the marginalization that we experience, that something as specific as anti-Black racism exists. And we might be, again, experiencing a lot of discrimination, but it doesn't mean that that's where the story ends, right? Anti-Black racism is quite strong in the United States, and we should really understand how it operates so that we can be part of the change that makes that a distant memory.
So you said, you talked about benefiting from the system. And one of the things that strikes me is that, particularly for populations that are largely immigrant populations, one of the reasons they immigrate is to benefit from the system. You know, in other words, for a better life, for all of those kinds of things. So how do you parse those two conflicting?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So what I'm thinking about when I say benefiting from the system is, in a lot of immigrant communities, there's a discourse that immigrants have this superhuman work ethic, right? Like I'm an immigrant, and I personally hate immigrants get the job done. I think it's part of really buying into this idea that somehow we're really exceptional. And one of the things to remember is that, sure, a lot of immigrants, especially if they're undocumented, they work really hard, but they work really hard because they have to. They work really hard because they know that if they have secured a job, it will be much harder for them to get another stable paying job than it would be for someone who is a US citizen or a US resident, right? And so one of the kind of pernicious consequences of this discourse of like, I'm an immigrant, I work really hard, is then buying into the idea that, say, our coworkers who are African American are lazy. And this is an idea, I'm gonna speak very truthfully here. This is an idea that is really strong in a lot of Latinx immigrant communities, that African American people are lazy, they just don't move as fast, well, they don't want to work. And I've had discussions with family members, right, and other community members about, well, you know, why do you think, for example, my dad worked in poultry, right? And the poultry, the kind of poultry work he did, he worked on the line, so he had to pick out pieces of chicken, right? So it used to be 80 birds a minute. It climbed up to 100 birds a minute. The USDA keeps moving up the ante. You know, by the time my dad is retired now, by the time he retired, he could barely stand up by Friday. It took him all weekend to recover, and then he'd be out at it again on Monday. In that situation, when I've spoken to him about this kind of stuff, I would ask him, why do you move so fast? The line keeps moving because you as workers keep meeting that demand. And he'd be like, well, because otherwise I won't have a job. But I would say, like, but if all of you actually took a lead from your Black coworkers who are like refusing to work just, you know, as fast, then you would all be better off. So there's a I don't know if it's a disconnect, but there's something at play there, right? In terms of believing like, oh, we're meeting this demand, so we're working really hard, versus Black coworkers who are resisting, right? I understand that not as a very purposeful act. Like the USDA can say it's going to be 120 birds a minute, but if you're still paying me $7.95, I'm going to stick to 80 birds a minute or 100 birds a minute. So, and this happens in a lot of different industries. For example, the other example I'll give is after Katrina, there were a lot of Latinxs that were hired by local companies. And again, you hear these discourses of like, oh, you know, Mexicans are such good workers. They pick up a broom during their break versus African-American workers or even sometimes white workers, right? And the reality is like, right, but a lot of the people you hired were undocumented. So they're trying to keep their jobs. And also you did not hire Black people or white people because they were unionized and you would have to pay them a higher salary. So that's what I mean by we need to do better. We need to learn better to really understand the way in which we're often used against each other to keep each other in place.
Thank you. I want to switch and let the questions coming in the chat, but I want to ask you one more thing before I do that. And that's just to talk a little bit about how your research, you mentioned it, but how your research informs your teaching. And there are students on the line, and I think knowing something about your classes and how these two things work together with people.
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously race, ethnicity, certainly my own experiences as being an immigrant have really informed my teaching. I mean, very, very obviously by the subject matter that I'm interested in, what I teach, but I think more generally, what I tell a lot of my students is, you know, one of the kind of worst things that we can do is just believe that our narrative, whatever our experience is the thing that is Latinidad, is the thing that it means to be a college student, is the thing that means to be a worker, because our experiences are singular, but if we allow them to represent everyone else, then we lose out again on that learning opportunity. And so in teaching, I spend a lot of time talking about race, ethnicity, gender, about categories and systems, right? How systems are built, how we contribute to systems of power, how we resist systems of power. And really to understand that, you know, the material we're learning about isn't to target one specific person. It's for us to gain a better understanding of what this country means, how it's operated, and again, how we can do better.
Great. So Linda, I think I could turn it to you to go to the chat and get some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has just been amazing, not only informative, but really, really interesting and entertaining. I'm going to start maybe from the top and work down. So the first question that was shared is, I realize that your research is not focused on Muslims, but would you compare this to the treatment of Muslims in Islamophobia in any way? And I think, you know, the more general question is what you're saying, can it be translated to other groups and discrimination that are experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, so I think the clearest way where we can see a connection between some of the things that I've discussed in Islamophobia is that there are often watershed moments. So for example, we're a few days away from the anniversary, or a few days past from the anniversary of 9/11. 9/11 was one of those watershed moments. Now, it doesn't mean that there wasn't Islamophobia before 9/11, but 9/11 itself in the United States is one of these moments where, again, as a consequence of that, the Department of Homeland Security was built. There was Muslim registry. We as a nation were told Muslim people were dangerous, right? That all Muslim people were terrorists, that all of them were out to get us. And lots of us, white, Black, Asian, Indigenous, Latinx, we also bought into Islamophobia, right? So this goes back to my, I think the last point I made, which is like, we're used to kind of keep each other in place, to kind of police each other. And there's a lot of really great work that is done on also the multifacetedness of Islamophobia. Are you a Black Muslim? Are you a white Muslim? Do you wear hijab in the case of women, the head covering? There are so many factors that shape Islamophobia as well. Location, familiarity with Muslim friends and neighbors, all of these things, you can see a lot of parallels. So I think that's what I would say. There are watershed moments, and if you pay close enough attention, if you study this, you can see the way in which Islamophobia is mobilized at different moments in different parts of the country.
Thank you. Next one, would you say that the closeness to whiteness is common across different Latinx groups? What do we know about our new generation of Latinx as young people, in other words? Do they still have this whiteness ideologies?
That's a really great question. One of the difficulties is that in speaking about Latinxs, again, I'm working with a very big category, but even our ideas about white supremacy, for those of us who have immigrant roots, those ideas come from our native countries, from Mexico, from El Salvador, from Nicaragua, from Cuba, from the Dominican Republic. So our ideas about whiteness have their origins in the countries in which we were born. And then we come here, and then here we learn the American version, right? The American flavor of white supremacy and whiteness. And so it's hard for me to say, like, this is what all young people are thinking. I think by listening to young people, Twitter is a great place to do this. What I'm learning is that, young people are really pushing us to be specific, right? To define our terms, that in some ways it's really not fair, not right to solely talk about Latinxs as a homogenous group, that we really need to name Black Latinxs, to name Indigenous Latinxs, Asian Latinxs, mestizos or mixed people, and white Latinxs, right? There's, broadly speaking, in Latin America, there's this idea that racism is something that you learn in the United States, that, Argentina isn't racist, that Mexico isn't racist, because the ideas around race are different. But if you look at the representations of who the, not just the elite in terms of wealth, but who is on their media, who gives the nightly news, who are the executives of all these countries, they tend to be white and they tend to be mixed, light skin, mixed, mestizos, right? So Mexico, other countries in Latin America don't have a foot to stand on in terms of the fact that they're not racist. But because this is something that we're taught, we again start perpetuating this idea that that racism is something that's just American when it isn't. So I know I didn't quite answer the question, but I think all I can say is like, learn from young people, pay attention to them. I think they're really trying to do the work.
Part of your answer, I think, kind of gets at the next question a little bit, which is, could you unpack the different labels, Hispanic, Latinos, Latinx, and to connect this to something that was brought up later, because they're sort of a similar question, that not a lot of Latinos know what the term Latinx is. So right. Who are you calling Latinx, and how do you unpack those terms?
That's a great question. So let me condense 50 years of debate into hopefully like 3 minutes. So amongst ethnic studies scholars, so people who do this kind of work, Hispanic is a term, we understand Hispanic to be a term that was created by the US government, something imposed on us. So under the label Hispanic, they include Spaniards from Spain. And Latin America as a landmass that was colonized by Spain, I have more in common with someone from Guatemala, a Colombian American, someone from the DR, from the Dominican Republic, than I do with a Spaniard, right? So in the 80s, there started to be this critique of, you're trying to separate us out into this category that doesn't make sense to us. So that's where the push to Latinas and Latino, well, initially it was Latinos, came from. Now in Spanish, the O is gendered male, the A or the A is gendered female. So shortly after, Latinos became this, this label that was based on Latin America, right? So it includes, or should include, the Caribbean, Brazil, if Brazilians want to be called as such, because we all should have autonomy about, how we define ourselves. There was then also the gendered critique that referring to Latinos with an O excludes women. And so there was a push for including the A. So the USLT program, the formal name is US Latina/Latino Studies. The X is built off of that. So it still includes all of Latin America, but the X is really meant to be gender neutral. The X comes from queer spaces in lots of parts of the United States, but one of the main sites was San Francisco about maybe 10, 15 years ago. Queer spaces, some would say radical spaces, but the critique is the A and the O is a gender binary. So even though you're trying to be inclusive, you're excluding genderqueer, gender nonconforming people. And so the best way to create inclusion, if this is what you want, is to use the X in Latinx. Now, as this moniker has kind of boomed nationally among certain groups, there's a critique that the X is not, doesn't make sense in Spanish. We're contaminating a beautiful language, and here I have to resist rolling my eyes a lot, because language changes, they evolve over time. If you don't want to use Latinx, what they're using in Latin America for being gender inclusive is a E. So instead of Latinos, it's Latines. And to the question of a lot of Latinos don't know or are not familiar with Latinx, that's okay, they can learn. I would never impose a label on anybody. If somebody doesn't want to be called Latinx, that's fine. But I think, just saying we've never done this before is not a good reason to not adapt a new practice, especially when people from our community are telling us that they are marginalized, that they are erased, that the spaces that are supposed to be safe and inclusive for them are not. So that's why I think it's really important to use Latinx when we're talking about a big group, especially if we're meant to be inclusive.
Thank you. The next question, I think, is in two parts, and I might have to ask the questioner exactly to make sure I get this right.
Okay.
Thinking on recent scandals of racial fraud, can you comment on how Afro-Latinx Caribbeanness is such an active space of racialization, whiteness, and Blackness. Daryl, did I get that right? I think the question is to comment on this particular issue of racial fraud.
Yeah, can you just read the last bit? Is an active space of
racialization, whiteness, and Blackness.
Racialization. Yeah.
And Ida included the specific examples of Krug and Carrillo.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, everybody.
I like that it's a two-pronged question from two different
right.
two different people. Yes. So I've been thinking a lot about this, as many of us have who are in this field. So an active space of racialization, whiteness. So if anybody is unfamiliar, the Krug and Carrillo are two, I should say Carrillo, are two people. I'm going to take them each separately. So Carrillo, until quite recently, was a professor at George Washington University. He said he was a Black Caribbean queer gay man. He died, I believe, of COVID just a few months ago. And upon his death, the world found out, because his family called him out, that he actually wasn't Caribbean. He just created this identity as a Black Caribbean man. He even wrote a book called Losing My Spanish. So that sent kind of mini shockwaves, or shockwaves through the Latinx studies community. And I think, was it just last week? It seems like I've lived with this Krug story much longer. Just last week, Jessica Krug published a piece in Medium where she said she'd constructed the slide. Long story short, she's a white Jewish woman who said she was Afro-Latina, like Puerto Rican, from the Bronx, from El Barrio. And so you have these two instances of people who are not Latinx claiming Latinidad. I think it's important to understand, though, that Carrillo, or again, Carrillo, was a Black man. So the kind of masquerade was around ethnicity. And, in terms of power, this is something that I think is important when we have these discussions. As a gay Black man, Carrillo didn't have a lot of power in the United States, even though he was a well-respected author at this great university, right? So his masquerade with ethnicity, I think, there's something else at play, again, because he, in the society, he's not a person with a lot of power. Krug, on the other hand, as a white Jewish woman, she was both, and as a white Jewish woman who constructed an identity around being Black, her masquerade is more intense, more egregious, because she was both claiming a race that she does not belong to, didn't grow up with, and then also imbued it with the worst racialized ideas we have as a society about Black people, right? So she constructed a mother who was a sex worker, presumably a Black mother who was a sex worker, her Black siblings as people who had been incarcerated. She would wear really kind of tight clothing, strappy clothing to conferences, big hoops, and be kind of really in your face. So if any of you are familiar with the idea of a kind of like, someone from the ghetto, quote unquote, this is what she was enacting, right? Her racial masquerade was one that really drew on the worst ideas about Blackness. And I think, the active space of racialization of whiteness and Blackness, I'm almost done. I mean, again, she perpetuated and drew from the worst ideas of Blackness in an attempt to distance herself from whiteness, which I'm not on her head. I don't know what was going on there, but this is something that she spent close to 20 years doing. and I think there's also something to be said about the Caribbean aspect, right? Craig said she was from Puerto Rico, Corey said he was from Cuba. So there's something about maybe our general unfamiliarity with Caribbeanness that allowed each of them to draw from this idea of just like this kind of marked, kind of exotic place versus saying like, oh, I'm Mexican, right? Because we as a society think we know what Mexican people are and what they look like and how they behave, even though that's probably not true, right? So I'm sure there's a lot more to be said, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Bonnie, we have 4 minutes left. Should I take one more question?
Yeah, why don't you take one more and then we'll say thank you.
Okay. One more question. Perla.
Yes.
Okay. Donald Trump often pits groups against each other. He blames immigrants for the lack of jobs for Black people in the US. This kind of divisive rhetoric has been pervasive throughout US history, and it shields white people from blame. It disrupts coalition building that can help fight against power structures. I think of this discourse as promoting horizontal racism between groups of color. Do you have theories, or what theories do you use to explain these kinds of divisive rhetorics?
So I think the theory, and it's not mine, is white supremacy. The way that white supremacy works is by what I call putting each other in place or keeping each other in check, is what you have named horizontal racism, right? Instead of us as Black, Indigenous, people of color really seeing each other's struggles, and this also isn't to say that our struggles are even or equal, right? In these discussions, we tend to ignore or invisibilize Indigenous people. Indigenous people are here, they're alive, they're still fighting for their rights, for land rights, right? All of us who are in the United States are on Indigenous lands. And in these larger discussions, we can't say that we're for equity if we are not having any sort of discussion about what does reparations for Indigenous people look like, right? We're probably all not gonna get up and leave, right, this country. So what does that look like? So in terms of, horizontal racism, again, I think it goes back to really learning and understanding each other's histories and struggles of not just oppression, but of fighting back, of resistance, of organizing, and looking toward moments when, we've been really close in a myriad of ways. I'm thinking right now of Robin D.G. Kelly's, I think it was his first book on Black communists in Alabama, right? Southerners get cast as these backward hillbillies, right? But here was a Black community in the 1930s who said, communism is the way to go. We need to put our resources together, right? And the important takeaway from that isn't necessarily the ideology or the goal of communism, but really working together and finding a system in the 1930s as Black people, right? And if we take the time to really learn about each other's histories of resistance, then I think we will be more equipped to really be genuine, informed allies. Allyship is active. It's a verb. I'm still constantly learning, and I hope to be learning when I'm 70 about where I can improve, how I can do better.
Thank you. Bonnie, I'll turn it back to you for the last minute.
Well, Perla, thank you so much. This has really been great. I think we've all learned a lot. You challenged us to think. I have thousands more questions I could ask you. And there may be something else that you would like to kind of say as a final word before I sign off. So let me just give you a chance to do that.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here to kick this off. And I would just like to encourage you, if you have any more questions, please reach out to me. I'm happy to be engaged. And I will take this as an opportunity to give a special pitch to USLT. So the Latino Studies program is a minor open to any undergraduate student. If those of you who are teachers or have contact with students, if they're interested in social justice and these issues of equity, USLT is a great space for them to learn. And we would be happy to have them in the classroom.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Perla. And you've really kicked this off in a wonderful way. I want to remind people that this is the first of 6 of these that we will be doing this semester. Every couple of weeks we'll be featuring one of our faculty, and now they have a high bar. They're all wonderful, but they have a high bar to step up to. So I encourage you to tell a friend, invite your students, invite others to join us, and to tell people who missed this that we will be posting the recording of it on the ARHU website. So please look for it, and you can find the whole program if you scroll down the website, down to the bottom where it says events, things happening, and you'll find the whole program. So thank you so much for being with us today. And again, thank you, Perla. You're wonderful.
Thank you so much.